Hi, I'm Billy. And welcome to Jack of Traits. In this video, we will add an essential improvement for our front-end's dynamic multiple pages. And without further ado, let's jump right into it. Now that we're able to make a CRUD operation for our dynamic multiple pages, let's go ahead and create the basic logic that should be handled by our front-end route. When you go to the main route, the localhost 8000 of our application, you will see an error. The reason is when setting the route, your Laravel application expects a value from the URL slug. You see this error because our front-end is still missing a feature. And that feature is to be able to identify the home page and the 404 page not found page. For us to attach this feature, we should add two database columns to our pages table. Go to the root of your Laravel application and open up your command line. Create a new database migration file to add the two database columns or fields. Open the new migration file and add these two fields. We will just set these two fields in a Boolean type. The isDefault home field will serve as our main flag to identify if the page is our home page. And the isDefault not found field will serve as our main flag to identify if the page is our 404 not found page. Now run the PHP artisan migrate to actually add those two fields in our pages database table. Now that we have these two fields, let's go ahead and open our app, HTTP, Livewire, pages component class. Add two public variable that will represent those two fields that we just created just now. In our case, we just created two Livewire public variables called isSetToDefault homepage and isSetToDefault not found page. And the next thing we need to do is add two checkboxes inside our modal form component. Open up your Livewire, pages.blade.php, and add these checkboxes. In this approach, whenever we want to assign a particular page to be our default home page or default 404 not found page, we can easily check and uncheck the checkboxes inside our modal form component. Now we will prepare these two checkboxes and add wire model to each one of them like so. In this part, I'm just basically styling these elements with Tailwind CSS. One thing about Tailwind is that, even if Tailwind CSS eventually makes your markups gigantic, it offers you more flexibility in CSS styling. By adding more class names specified by the Tailwind CSS, you can make your HTML look really good. Of course, with great CSS flexibility using class names comes great, huge, gigantic markups. Great, now that the checkboxes are ready, we should add them to our model data so we will be able to save them along when we update or create another page. If you have been following along in this series, you should know by now that this is the function that we custom made to provide us with ease in saving our data in the database. By making this approach, we are able to map our Livewire public variables to the fields in our pages database table. Now let us check if we can successfully save these fields when checking our checkboxes. Alright, now that we can save our checkboxes value for the default home page and 404 not found, let's go ahead and update our data table so that we will be able to identify if the current page we're looking at is the home page or the 404 page not found. Note that we are using a PHP ternary operator here, which is a shorthand for a simple if-else statement. Here, we are just going to display an HTML span element if the isDefault home field value is true. And we're also going to do the same for the isDefault not found field. If you notice, we can assign a single page as the default home page and as the 404 page simultaneously. This should not be the case because we should only have one default home page and one default 404 page in our CMS. So, for us to solve that issue, we should detect if the set as default home page checkbox and the 404 checkbox is checked. So the goal is, every time we check the set as default home page, we should automatically set the not found checkbox on check and vice versa. So let's go ahead and add two functions that will run every time is set to default home page and set to default not found page is updated. Remember the updated function in Livewire lifecycle hooks? We are going to use that here. Since this function will only run when the is set to default home page variable is updated, we will set the is set to default not found page variable to be null here. And this function will only run when the is set to default not found page variable is updated. We will set the is set to default home page variable to be null here as well. Using this approach, we will be able to make sure that we only check one of the checkboxes. Now that we can check one checkbox at a time, let's go ahead and reset these two variables as well. We will refactor our code later, but this time, for us to emphasize that we are setting these variables to null, let's just assign them explicitly here temporarily. This is also very important. Every time we update, we should also load the values from our model. So our two new variables will be set to null if it happens to retrieve a false value from the database. And we will just set them directly to true if it doesn't have a false value. Let's go ahead and check our new feature. As you can see, although we can only check one checkbox at a time, we can still assign more than one home page. And we can also add more than one 404 page not found too. This should not be the case. So for us to solve that, we should add two more functions that will unassign the default home page and the 404 page not found in our database table before we create or update a specific page. So let's go ahead and do that. So the logic we put here is pretty straightforward. When the is set to default home page variable is not null, we will update our isDefault home column with a value of true and assigns them to false. And the same logic goes for the isDefault not found column as well. Now that we have that established, let's call out those two functions in our update function just right before updating the page. These two database call will only run if we see a value inside our is set to default home page and set to default not found page variables, so don't worry about calling them every time we update our pages. Now, let us check to see if our enhancement is working. Let us set a particular page to become our default home page and another page set as our default 404 error page. Great, now that our code is working, let us go ahead and add these two functions in our create function like so. Now that we have that established as well, we will now proceed in adding the logic that will handle our front end for multiple dynamic pages. Remember that we needed our front end to smartly select the default home page and 404 page in our simple content management system. Let's go ahead and open up our Frontpage Livewire class file and our frontpage.blade.php. The mount function is the first function that will run and receive any params we pass from the routes. In our case, let's give our URL slug variable a default null value. And the first we would want to satisfy is when the URL slug has a null value, we will get the default home page we specified. If you think that what if we don't set a default home page or default 404 page in our admin panel, we would still get error, right? Yes, of course. But we want this to be as straightforward as possible. So to avoid further complications, let's tackle the main logic for our front page first. And we will add additional logic to our CMS later once we have the main dish served. And we will put this one in the else statement. The other problem is, what if there is a URL slug value, but the record we retrieve doesn't exist in the database? Since that possibility is possible, we should programmatically retrieve the default 404 page we just set a while ago to be displayed in this case. Alright, now that we have that established, let's check if it's working. Great, now that we have everything falling into place, let's add a bit of an enhancement to our code. We are already finished explicitly resetting our variables in this case. I want you to go ahead, delete this function, and replace everything with this reset function that is a built-in Livewire function like so. We will also remove our generate slug function and finally use the Laravel's built-in str function class. In Laravel, there are already tons of built-in functions like the str class. In the str class, we have this slug static function that turns your variables into URL slugs. And because of the kind of convenience that Laravel provides for us, beginners who might have been working first in Laravel might find themselves not learning things that a native PHP language has to offer. It is also essential that even if you are using any programming language framework, you should also know how to implement things without a framework. Using the native language can also help you understand what lies behind every functions, methods and classes of a programming framework. Because studying the native language will help you become a better programmer. And who knows, you might become an author of a programming framework in the later years. Just keep coding. And if you notice, we are still not using the Tailwind CSS for our front-end page yet. The reason is that before we begin styling our front-end page with Tailwind, we will tackle a basic understanding of why the Tailwind CSS tends to build your markup into a gigantic piece of text just to make it look good. It may seem a bit of a disadvantage at first, and it may still be tedious even after you learn it. But when you begin to understand the pattern of the Tailwind CSS, I'm pretty sure you'll start loving it. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, comment, share, and subscribe if you're new to this channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll get notified whenever a new video is up. Stay tuned, and see you in the next video.